how do you say that you care if you were never going to talk to us? If you were never going to meet all of these students and all these people where they're at?
Mom, let's support each other! We have nothing to lose for our change! We have nothing to lose for our change!
I was assigned to cover a hearing in a case with a young man called CJ Stock, who was effectively in jail for 7 months for what ended up being 2 traffic violations. There was this whole history of kind of contentious relationship between CJ and the police, and this story was to kind of follow up and contextualize and analyze. He has both hands out, but he's still like pointing the gun at him. Before I became a journalist and before I was reporting for the Missourian, I worked in federal prosecution as a paralegal. And so in that work, I had to help send people to jail. Effectively, I helped convict people. And so I just remembered all of that, seeing CJ that day in the courtroom. One way I've seen white privilege sort of manifest itself is how we discuss kind of self-portrayals, and in this particular story that I worked on through guns. So there's an element in CJ's case where part of his probation was he wasn't allowed to have firearms, to be in possession of firearms, and then a couple months after he's released, he puts this music video online that shows him holding what appears to be a firearm, a pretty powerful one. So then there's this image of him out there, like this young black man with the gun. And how is that sort of portrayed in the media versus, I think, of other portrayals of guns in the media. I'm thinking specifically of Jason Kander when he ran for Senate, and Eric Greitens when he ran his gubernatorial campaign, and their images that they put out there. And these are all, like from CJ to Jason Kander to Eric Greitens, these are all self-curated images of all of them with guns, and all of them showing prowess over guns and over firearms, and how the media responds to each of those.
So the story that I'm working on is about the intersection of privilege and sexuality and how it's manifested in a religious setting. So with my story, the personal narrative is in there specifically because I'm queer, and I think that it's important as far as privilege goes to talk about your personal experiences, to really put a face to the idea of privilege. I've had a very religious upbringing, and that's kind of what drew me to the idea of the church in the first place. I felt a little bit cast off from the church when I was younger, and so I thought it'd be interesting to talk about that experience for LGBT people in general. It's tough because I've been the beneficiary of privilege. I can't talk to people and say, oh, well, I experienced this because of my race. I can talk about good things I've experienced, but a lot of times I can't reference an experience that a black person has had, and that's not my story to tell, but I suppose it's just a lot of times I just try to be an advocate for those people.
This kind of, I thought, was troubling. One is about a scholarship that the state of Missouri offers to in-state students, and I've found through looking at 10 years worth of numbers on that fewer than 1 percentage point of the winners are black, 80% of the winners are white. I mean, you look here in the black column, students or column for black winners, these periods here mean there's no winners. These little asterisks mean that it's fewer than 5. This is the white column here. And then the other part of the story is kind of anecdotes about my childhood, education. I was born with a little bit of brain damage, which people believe gave me a learning disability. My mom found a bunch of these old documents from my childhood. It was weird reading through a lot of this stuff because forgotten a lot of these things. I was reading, here's a report card, reading about a kid who I kind of remembered but had forgotten. Had I not been privileged in having a tireless advocate of a mother and a father who was a doctor who could pay for a very expensive boarding high school, I probably wouldn't be here today talking to you about this. My personal story is an example of the power of privilege, I think. I mean, my trajectory was a bad one. I was really unhappy and I was having a hard time in school of how I behaved, how that could have landed me in some serious trouble. I mean, twice the cops came to school.
I did an essay about looking at race and privilege 2 years after the Missouri football team chose to boycott football activity and join the concerned student in 1950 in their protests. And then just kind of like looked into how over the past 2 years, like really nothing much has changed in terms of like the racial climate on campus. Like there's still instances where black students are getting shouted at racial slurs at them. We saw in August the white supremacy group sent flyers around campus. And like, because I played sports my whole life, I've come to learn, you know, I think sports is one of the best ways to teach people that, like, you know, these like racial boundaries like that do exist shouldn't exist, because, you know, when you're working on a team, you know, playing on the same field as different guys, like, you know, everyone's the same. It just comes down to how much work you put into it and, you know, how much you care about it. Moore and Anthony Sherrill's two of the black athletes I focus on in my story. They're entering their final stretch of their college football career. So like, what's happened in those 2 years since, like, did their firsthand role in this boycott like actually, you know, fire them up to be more active on campus? So rather than kind of focus on like what happened too much, which is what I think that some people are still doing, like, why not, you know, move from what happened to now what's happening here in 2017, and kind of how are the football players either like responding to it or not at all?
I mean, white privilege is inconvenient to acknowledge it. It was uncomfortable, it is uncomfortable for me to acknowledge it, because it brings into question all of my accomplishments.
And this forced me to kind of go to, in a good way, it challenged me to go to a place where I would sort of have to hold myself to account.
Initially, like, the whole class kind of gave pause, because it's like we're about to take on, you know, a topic that, like, in itself is like a bunch of white journalism students put out like a white privilege package. Like, they're just kind of using their own privilege as journalists at this, you know, at this place to, you know, to like speak for how they feel about the cause.
I think that we had to take it into kind of bite-sized pieces, because privilege is just so large, and there's no way you can just write like a 1,000-word story and explain everything about privilege. So I thought that I would bring up like my sexuality and the idea of heterosexual privilege, because that's something that I know about, and I can bring my personal experience to that, especially with my reporting.